everybody. This is Paul Hitchcock with the Asset Protection Estate Planning firm BarthCalderon. Welcome to Wealth Protector TV, and some of you may be listening to this on Wealth Protector Radio, our podcast show. I'm here with my colleague Brian Chow, who's one of our estate and asset protection planning experts. Brian, can you hear me okay?
Hear loud and clear, Paul.
Great. Well, today we're talking about limited liability companies, and all of you listening, I'm sure, have read something about these LLCs. And one of the questions that we get a lot at all the workshops we do across the country at all these different groups is, and this is for rental income property owners, should I use an LLC? Should I put one, if I have 3 properties, should I put them all in one LLC? So we want to answer today the pros and cons of doing that. So Brian, how would you answer that question?
Sure. So from an asset protection standpoint, it's almost always better to have each property in its own LLC. Many of the listeners, I'm sure, have heard of the saying of "don't put all your eggs in one basket." That's essentially what you're doing when you're putting multiple properties into an LLC. For those of you who aren't familiar with how an LLC works, essentially what you're doing is you're creating a separate business with its own assets and liabilities. So think of it like a shoebox. And what happens is we put, let's say, a property into that shoebox. And the idea is if we maintain that LLC correctly, we set it up and maintain it correctly, then let's say something happens with that property. A tenant slips and falls down the steps and they break their neck and they say that the guardrail was improperly maintained and now they're out for blood, right? If we've set it up correctly, then that liability should stay within the box. So we're keeping that liability from popping out and attaching to your house, your bank accounts, your other properties, etc. But if you have multiple properties inside of that LLC, then that liability can attach to whatever assets are in that shoebox. So that's something that we really want our investor clients to be aware of, is we want to find that right balance between putting, perhaps sometimes people don't want to set up so many entities because they say, hey, there's a cost to set it up, and there's also, we also have to maintain these things. But from an asset protection standpoint, it's almost always better for each property to be in its own LLC.
So
but there are, yeah.
I was going to say, so I've heard it come up before. You talk about in workshops that, let's say cost aside, that, we're not worried about budget here on setting up these LLCs, that you have 3 properties. If one of those properties has no equity in it or very little equity, is it okay to put a property with little or no equity into an LLC with a property that has maybe some meaningful equity? Would that be okay?
Sure. So that just depends on the client, right? So a lot of that conversation is kind of really feeling out how much risk the client is willing to take on. And so, for instance, if you had a couple of properties that didn't have a lot of equity in it, let's just say they're single family, residences out in the desert somewhere, and there's not a ton of equity to protect, and because they're single family residences, there's only really one family living there, plus whoever is coming onto the property. That's perhaps a relatively low liability, low risk situation where you might say, okay, why don't we put those 2 properties into one LLC?
Okay.
Now let's say, for another example, to what you were saying, let's say now we had another property that had significant equity. Let's say it was a 8-plex with, $500,000 worth of equity in it. And then you also had the other property, which is the shack in the desert. Well, you may not want to put that shack into the shoebox with the property that has a lot of equity, because now you're exposing the high value property to the liability of the shack. So you probably wouldn't want to mix those 2. But again, if you had multiple properties that didn't have a whole lot of equity, you can combine them together to say, okay, we can kind of pool that risk because there's really not that much exposure if there's not a lot of equity tied in with them.
So it sounds like the takeaway here is that if you've got multiple properties, it's a case-by-case scenario on whether to use multiple LLCs or put them in one. There is no off-the-shelf solution, you got to get with an expert and really figure it out. Is that a fair assessment?
That's correct. And so that's a big part of what we do day in and day out, is really getting to know our clients, understanding what their goals are, what their risk tolerances are, what their assets are, so that we can guide them to make the decisions that are most appropriate for them in their situation.
Great. Brian, thanks so much for joining, and thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, we'll see you then.